book launch for. Gabino Iglesias is a writer, journalist, professor, and book critic living in Austin. He is the author of Coyote songs and Zero Saints. His words have appeared in venues including the New York Times, the Rumpus, and the Los Angeles Times. He is the book reviews editor for PANK Magazine and a columnist for LitReactor and CLASH Media. Please welcome Gabino.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you take nothing else home tonight, please remember this was probably the most diverse reading you've been to. I thought about bringing some of my favorite people, and I think it worked out beautifully because it's been a roller coaster. Thankfully, no one has screamed at you in Spanish, so here I am. And here we go. Oh, this is since we're launching, I guess I've been reading from this printed out. First time I'm actually reading with the book in my hand, so don't get happy yet. I just wanted to say, as the first official reading, I want to send it out, along with my heart, to every mother and child getting tear gassed at the border, because this is for them. Outside Piedras Negras, a few miles south of Colonia Venustiano Carranza, lay a few square miles of arid, uninhabited land. The ghost of Immaculada stood in the middle of that nothingness, whispering bad words that took to the sky like birds of breath, looking for weak, angry, hurt souls to invade. They jumped on the back of words she had already vomited into the night air. Words pregnant with hate and hungry for blood. They joined like drops of water running down a surface, finding each other in that same miraculous way that loose hairs in a house can find each other and morph into small balls of discarded human. Immaculada, almost invisible to the naked eye, was unmoving, except for a ghostly tongue that never stopped stirring. Her new form, very much like the translucent version of the one that she'd had in life, whispered things into the wind so that they could reach ears on both sides of the border. Her anger was boundless. Her thirst for revenge tied her to this side of the veil, and she refused to cross over until enough blood had been spilled to satiate her thirst. Her powers would bring forth death and chaos. Her hechizos would shatter la frontera and poison the fish and make men and women lose their minds until the fire inside her had been extinguished, until enough blood had been seeped into the land around her, until the memory of her son was just a tiny star in a universe of screams and suffering. She was ready to stand there and speak into the wind until humanity once again became a forgotten footprint in the sands of time. Immaculada's consciousness was somewhere inside that ghost. She could think about what she had turned into, realize that the spirit world tugged at her feet and demanded her presence, but ire and her thirst for revenge had become strong driving forces behind her state, strong enough to keep her between worlds. With the night around her like a cloak and her magic already working, she allowed the memories to come, to once again fill her with purpose. Everyone in Piedras Negras had been sad to learn their curandera was leaving. Immaculada didn't want to leave her people behind, including her mother, from who she still had a lot to learn. But gang violence had already taken a son from her, and she would not let that happen twice. She refused to feed her own flesh and blood into the hungry beast known as los carteles. La muerte es inevitable, pero se le pueden poner trabas en el camino. Vivimos aquí, her husband Rafael often said, pero la vida está al otro lado del río. Vivir rodeado de muerte no es vivir, es sobrevivir. Finally, in the middle of the night, a knock had come at their door. They packed light, just like the Coyote had instructed. With the essential pieces of their lives strapped to their backs, they left the home they had built. Immaculada could sense death in the air. She could feel the walls of the house tugging at them as if they'd become magnetized by the years spent inside them. The blood and the tears and stories and dreams and moments that happened inside them. She could also smell her family. The fear of her husband and child made their sweat smell like that of unwashed barn animals. The Coyote moved fast, desperately, the way that men move when the thing they're trying to escape lives inside them. He spat words the way people do when talking to lifelong enemies. His hands lingered on Inmaculada's ass too long as he helped her climb into the back of the truck. The souls inside were a collection of agony and distress. It was almost too much for Inmaculada. She wanted to clean them all, to bathe them in the river under a full moon, and then extract the bad things in their souls with an egg that they would later break against a rock somewhere in the desert. Instead, she had to sit there and try not to cry while looking into the eyes of mothers and fathers that were now living in a situation where they knew they had lost their ability to protect their children. The truck took off. Every sound coming from the vehicle made Inmaculada think they were in the belly of a metallic beast. The truck moved around from side to side, pushing warm bodies against each other. Time constricted and expanded at will. Curves became impossibly long. Heat became a thick monster around them, constant and inevitable. Uncertainty made their hearts beat faster, until the primal drum of fear hammered their heads and necks. No one spoke, and the sirens were whispered. Fears were confessed into the ears of family members by those who had them, and silently voiced to gods by those traveling alone. Eventually they came to a stop. All movement stopped, including that of the people. The truck settled. Silence hung in the air, like the world holding its breath. The air inside the trailer was heavy with the smell of fear, fright nerves, and blossoming regret. Children whispered, and a couple of heavy-set individuals breathed hard. The first hour went by in almost complete silence. No one knew where they were or what was going on outside those doors. The rhythm of fearful waiting, vibrating with the possibility of calamity at its center, overtook everything. The second hour made them forget the silence. Men who felt the air grow thin knocked on the doors. They called on the men who had driven them there. They did so tentatively at first, like children testing boundaries, and then with anger and desperation. The metal was unyielding, painfully unresponsive. The third hour brought with it rumors of abandonment. Some folks feared they were in the middle of nowhere and would remain there until they died. They'd all heard stories like that before, but it wasn't what they were experiencing. It just couldn't be. For a few frantic minutes, almost everyone pounded on some part of the truck. Voices rose in volume, became tinged with extreme anxiety. Words like dinero and cabrones and matar flew around like desperate birds, slamming against the inside of the trailer and bouncing back before being drowned by fresh screams. The cacophony scared Inmaculada's son so much that he buried his face in her chest and cried the way he cried when the pain was too much to handle, como un machito, which is what his father had been telling him to do since the second he started walking. The hot, wet air coming from his small mouth was just like the rest of the air around him, and Inmaculada knew that so much heat was a bad thing. The fourth hour brought La Huesuda to their midst. A woman started wailing, shaking her daughter as if trying to release her from some heat-induced stupor. The tiny body remained lifeless, soft, and relaxed in the unalterable way all soulless bodies become once the life force has left them. The mother cried, her tears mixing with the sweat that ran down her face. Some cried with her or for her. Some cried for themselves. Some cried for the meaning of that tiny body. Some just used their shaking hands to wipe away the sweat that kept coming. They felt themselves slide the rest of the way into panic. The heat soon became too much. Bodies that had been pressed against each other for hours now became threats. Everyone looked around then and saw nothing but oxygen thieves making the temperature rise. They were all submerged in a deadly collective fear, and pushing people away became a reasonable facsimile for aspirin. Cuando la muerte se presenta, cualquier vestigio de humanidad como símbolo de hermandad se desvanece, y una sed de sobrevivencia se presenta, animal e inevitable como un tornado. The fifth hour was the beginning of the end. The light coming through the few spots in the door announced the arrival of a new day. The temperature kept rising. Every exhalation contributed. Inmaculada couldn't hold her son any longer. The kid was breathing with his mouth open, gulping air so humid and blistering that it felt like soup. Then he stopped, and her heart shattered into a million pieces. The children were the first to go. The men joined in an effort to break down the doors. They made space on the floor and used their legs to kick the doors in unison. When that failed, the biggest ones joined forces and hurled their bodies together at the walls and the doors in a bizarre, grotesque ballet. Their flesh bounced off the doors time and again until the futility of their actions became as clear as their doom. They asked the women for help then and tried again, moving as a single body, an entity bent on survival, and none of it worked. All they managed to do was hurt themselves and increase the heat inside the trailer even more, turning it into a box of hell. Sweat poured off their bodies and made them look like they stepped in the shower fully clothed. There was no space to place the bodies, and those who had already died were just there. They were a hindrance to all who weren't tied to them by blood or love. Inmaculada couldn't cry. Her anger was bigger than anything she had ever felt, including her pain. She felt like her skin was spilling off her body. She didn't want to look at her son, his body somewhere on the floor in front of her, being trampled and kicked by desperate people looking for an inch of extra space where there was none. Her husband never came back. The last thing Inmaculada saw was a young boy like her son, his eyes open, his body on top of a man who was probably his father. Both were motionless, pushed against a wall. The father had become his son's deathbed. Inmaculada swore revenge against the man who had done this to them, swore she'd still stick around until all the Coyotes were dead and there was enough blood along the border to make powerful people take care of the problems that had put them in that trailer. Then she closed her eyes, felt sweat run down her eyelids like the last caress of her physical being, and stepped into the darkness. The hours that followed were filled with the loudest silence the desert had ever heard. Even the insects evaded the ominous stillness of the place and took their calls elsewhere. Birds made wild turns in the sky and changed direction as if they crashed against an unseen wall. Then, once darkness had once again descended on the trailer, which did nothing to lower the blistering temperatures that cooked the bodies trapped inside, Inmaculada's ghost emerged from the sand next to the truck's rear tires, like a bamboo shoot seen in Fast Forward. She felt her loss and her anger and opened her new mouth. The sound that came from it would be talked about for days. The man who came closest to nailing a description told his wife the next day, "Se me pararon todos los vellos del cuerpo, mujer. Pensé que un centenar de coyotes habían agarrado altoparlantes y gritados a la misma vez. Te juro que pensé que el que gritaba era el mismísimo diablo. However, the man was wrong. It wasn't 100 coyotes with bull horns howling at once, and it wasn't the devil himself. The thing that had screamed that night was the soul of a shattered, hurt mother, facing the loss of everything she loved. And that is something even the devil should fear. Thank you.